Cinema is a shapeless form. Through its endless experimentation, it yields wonderment through testing the limits of how one can convey stories. Yet with each story I saw, I learned to ask in equal measure not only which story was being told, but whose story was being told also. Though if that subject is known, then the great test of any artist is to breach the almost impenetrable blockade wherein story bridges said subject with its audience. Regardless of the level of realism incorporated in cinema, an artist can never bypass the acknowledgement of their audience. A director must know that the reality of a film's universe can't exist unless there is a present observer to watch the universe unfold. Thus, almost every film will at least attempt a fusion of the character's disposition with our own. But can we fully experience everything a character goes through if there is that unconscious barrier between subject and viewer? Is it possible to not only capture the emotional turmoil of our characters, but through the filmmaking, have the observer become a participator? In Elem Klimov's Come and See, the star of the movie is its subjectivity, a demonstration of us and the main character moving in tandem. Film is a synthesis of the visual and the oral. Sound and imagery are both tools the artist uses to communicate where the cinematic focus should lie, and through its manipulation of sight and sound, Come and See is a display of how the viewer becomes the main character by offering us the illusion of a shared sensory experience. Because whichever perspective film talks to us from, it too becomes our own. Filmmaking has the ability to tell stories from varying vantage points, and of all its techniques, sound is probably the most identifiable in doing this. If you want a story to come from a single subject's point of view, then the soundscapes are limited to what is only heard by that subject.
No, don't. I have no idea what you're talking about. No idea. This is all don't you understand it?
Sound subjectivity restricts what the audience hears to be shared solely by one character, becoming closer to their reality through the creation of a first-person narrative structure. But there are two types of subjective sound in cinema. There's the real and the impressionistic. To gain a heightened subjectivity, Come and See, rather than only using the literal sounds that surround a character, employs the accentuated sound they hear mentally.
Что иди? Пароль!
What if every sound that this film uses, both diegetic and non-diegetic, is actually just in the mind of our character? We hear what they think they hear. This type of sound design puts us directly in the perspective of our protagonist, because we aren't hearing the reality of the situation, we're hearing his reality of the situation. Come and See teaches us to pay attention to all of its sounds as we're plugged into the mind of the character. When thinking of past distress, it's natural to want to look away, but there's truthfulness in the memory of sound. And in a tale as traumatic as Fliora's, it's not as important that we hear everything our character hears, but more important that we hear how he hears it.
Ложись!
If we listen carefully to Come and See's sound design, we hear its subtle manipulation demonstrating the mental condition of our character. Pay attention to the noise of the crowd in this scene, where our protagonist discovers his dying father. Notice how the sound of the crowd was muted. The reality is that he's surrounded by voices that should drown out the speech, but instead we're hearing exactly what our character hears. Words so vitally important to him that everything else drifts into insignificance. This technique makes the journey less of something we watch and more of something we partake in. The film becomes a shared experience wherein our senses and the characters are one and the same, affecting us as equally as they do him. Sound is not just the noises around a character. They give way for a film to corporealise its trauma. We aren't bystanders to it if we literally feel it. In Come and See, everything we hear is how Fljóra hears it mentally. It gives the film the ability to delve deeper into his psychological state and in turn reflect it onto our own. Of course, it would be fine to mix and design the sound so that we only hear what Fljóra could feasibly hear. But in instances like this scene, when it should be impossible for him to hear anything, the sound remains as loud as ever. Earlier, Fljóra was able to block out all of the sound, and couldn't hear anything when the bombs deafened him. But now he's incapable of this, because of his deteriorating mental state. Sound design shouldn't just indicate what a character hears, but more so the effect those sounds have in the mind of the character. Even music can be thought of in this manner. Here, it becomes an abstract expression in Fliora's mind, attempting to bring childlike levity to a situation amidst chaos. If Hitchcock taught us anything about sound, it's that it's a gateway into our characters' reasoning, to demonstrate their warped interpretation of reality.
Knife.
Alice, cut us a bit of bread, will you?
Knife. A knife. A knife. A knife. A knife. A knife.
The way the sound is mixed is demonstrative of this. Room tones are silenced, so that the smallest details of sound are what stand out. Normally, these scenes would be balanced to have some tones of its surroundings heard, but because of the stillness of the background noise, the sounds we do hear act as signifiers that epitomise a specific moment. Our character hears things in a way that he finds sounds that will remind him most of the situation at hand and enhances them. Sounds are salient to our character, enhanced forms of his emotions at that time where everything else is negligible. Yet at the film's climax, the sound contrasts this to overwhelm us completely. Originally, the horror was in our character's mind, a deafening noise that imprisoned him in his own psyche, but now the horror has been externalised and all-encompassing. But we're still hearing his perception of reality. It's no longer a single sound that is representative of this moment, as every single sound he will hear will become associated with this horror. Up to this point, the sound had a quiet fragility. Now, it's become inescapable, both inside and outside of his mind, and Fliora will hear everything, whether he wants to or not. But if the purpose of the subjectivity is to replicate our character's senses, then the most important sense in cinema is sight. And Come and See has no secrets in its usage of the camera and from which perspective we're viewing the story. Almost every encounter Fliora has is shot from his POV. But like the established rules of how Come and See uses sound, we don't just see what the character sees, we see what he thinks he sees. Many of the POVs don't actually match the space of the image. For instance, in this scene, the POV of Fliora shouldn't continue once he looks away. Yet it continues. Why? Because we're seeing what Fliora envisions, and even when he turns, he imagines the goings-on in his mind. In essence, he still sees them. We see how Fliora thinks of things. His POV in situations is often exaggerated, having people appear far more intimidating than they actually are, or having his POV completely ignore the space of the image to show what he focuses on. The purpose is to use the positioning of the camera to not enforce continuity, but become the embodiment of Fliora's emotional state, both the character and us seeing things not necessarily as they actually are. There are moments where we see things that Fliora doesn't, but if we notice carefully, he hears them. Even when the camera appears to stray from its subjectivity, it's still showing us everything that Fliora is thinking of. Every sound and image is produced in the mind of our character, showing us his innermost experiences. Even when the camera detaches itself from him, his mind's eye sees that which he knows to be true, be it his traumatised mother watching him leave from an empty household, or the most horrific of circumstances. The camera acts as the omniscient entity gazing into Fliora's mind, but then what is the purpose of Fliora staring into the camera? Staring into the lens is a motif featured throughout Come and See, a very powerful one that serves to allow the humanity of our protagonist to be shown unfiltered. With Fliora's POVs, his objects are exaggerated to reflect his reactions to them, as the camera forces us to stare unflinchingly at his horror. If the camera didn't have this perspective, would we feel Fliora's anguish as much? Everything is inside Fliora's head, Even when he isn't present directly, we're still subjected to the horror of what it is to be a victim, which he is inseparable from. Thus, when he looks at the camera, it exemplifies how much he thinks himself a victim. The purpose of shooting the protagonist head-on like this is to show him completely vulnerable. It's not like an Ozu film where the camera placement is to gain a sense of the familial experience, it's to show our character utterly exposed.
И он сказал, без детей выходи.
Yet, all this time, the camera has never truly been the POV of the other person, it's just appeared to be. In this scene, the placement of the camera doesn't match how Glasha should see Fliada. And this is true with many scenes where Fliada appears to be addressing someone by breaking the fourth wall. But here, when it seems as though Fliada and a dying girl are looking into one another's eyes, we see where the girl is in the space of the image. They've never been looking into one another's eyes. The camera has never acted outside of Fliada's subjectivity. It's always been how he views others, or as he views himself as a victim. He looks at us helplessly, as we do to him. We're completely helpless in changing his fate, as much as he is in being saved. At these moments, both the audience and subject look at one another and share the same sentiments. We both are finally being completely assimilated as one by the filmmaker. Come and See tells its story the way only one as devastating as this can be understood, to infuse its character's experience with our own. Without this, the audience couldn't even begin to comprehend the terror of our character's plight. We too must experience it as he does, and the only way that this may be accomplished through cinematic means is to manipulate the audience's senses to replicate that of the protagonist. The intensity of the movie's subjectivity allows each subject to be judged and viewed on an equal plane. When shown unfiltered, we all have the potential to become the victimized or the tyrannical. We're all part of the same unremarkable species. Come and See is possibly the truest war film ever created, exploring the psychology of a victim of war and imprisoning its audience in their mind. We see everything how they see it. We hear everything how they hear it. And the necessity of this approach is indicated in the film's title, as we're invited to come and see what that really means.